Hélène Grimaud was born in the south of France in 1969, in a small town called Aix-en-Provence where the air smelled of lavender and the sun painted everything golden. She came into a world that had no idea what kind of force was growing inside this little girl. Her parents were not musicians, and there was no grand piano sitting in their modest home waiting for a prodigy to discover it. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives, and Hélène seemed like an ordinary child at first glance. But there was something different about her from the very beginning, something wild and untamed that would not fit into the neat boxes that society tried to build around children. When she was 7 years old, Hélène heard piano music for the first time in a way that truly reached inside her chest and grabbed hold of something she did not even know existed. It was not a gentle introduction or a careful awakening. It was like lightning striking dry ground and setting everything ablaze. She demanded to learn the piano with an intensity that frightened her parents. This was not the sweet request of a child wanting to try something new. This was hunger, raw and desperate, the kind that cannot be ignored or postponed. Her parents found a teacher and bought a piano, probably thinking this passion would fade like most childhood obsessions do. They had no way of knowing they had just opened a door that would never close again. But learning piano the traditional way felt like torture to young Hélène. She did not want to sit quietly and follow the careful progression of beginner exercises. She did not want to place her fingers exactly where the teacher said and count beats in the methodical way that was supposed to build a proper foundation. Her mind worked differently, moving in wild spirals and sudden leaps that made no sense to the structured world of classical music education. She wanted to devour the music whole, to throw herself into pieces that were far beyond her technical ability, to feel the emotional core of the composition even if her small hands could not yet execute every note perfectly. Her teachers saw this as defiance, as lack of discipline, as a fundamental flaw in her character that would prevent her from ever becoming a serious musician. The criticism started early and it was relentless. Teachers told her parents that she was too wild, too emotional, too resistant to proper training. They said her approach was all wrong, that she would never develop the technical precision required for professional performance if she continued to reject the careful building blocks of classical technique. Some refused to teach her at all after just a few lessons, throwing up their hands in frustration at this strange child who seemed to hear music in a completely different language than everyone else. They saw chaos where Hélène saw truth. They saw rebellion where she saw the only honest way to approach something as profound as music. The word undisciplined followed her like a shadow, whispered in conversations between teachers, written in evaluation notes, spoken directly to her face by instructors who believed they were helping her understand reality. Hélène's hands became a particular target of criticism. They were not the hands that teachers expected to see on a serious piano student. Other children her age had small, delicate fingers that could be carefully trained and shaped. Hélène's hands were different, strong and almost aggressive in the way they attacked the keyboard. She did not caress the keys with the gentle touch that was considered proper for a young girl. She struck them with force and conviction, pulling sounds from the piano that were too big, too intense, too raw for what was expected from someone her age. Teachers told her she was playing wrong, that she would injure herself, that this violent approach to the instrument showed a fundamental misunderstanding of what piano performance should be. They tried to gentle her touch, to soften her attack, to make her hands behave the way hands were supposed to behave on a piano. But something inside Hélène refused to be tamed. Even as the criticism piled up and the rejections multiplied, even as teacher after teacher told her she was doing everything wrong, she could not make herself play the way they demanded. It felt like lying. It felt like taking something pure and true and twisting it into a shape that pleased others, but killed the essential spirit of what music meant to her. She was not trying to be difficult or rebellious for the sake of rebellion. She was simply incapable of approaching the piano with anything less than her whole self, with all the fierce intensity and emotional honesty that burned inside her. When she sat at the piano, she disappeared into the music completely, and what emerged was not the careful, controlled performance of a well-trained student, but something much more dangerous and alive. Her parents watched this struggle with growing concern. They saw their daughter being rejected and criticized by expert after expert, all of whom seemed to agree that Hélène's approach was fundamentally flawed. These were professionals, people who had spent their lives in music, who had trained countless successful students. How could all of them be wrong? Maybe Hélène was simply not cut out for classical piano. Maybe this dream that consumed her was just a childish obsession that would lead nowhere but disappointment. The pressure mounted from every direction. Teachers suggested she give up or try a different instrument. Other students and their parents looked at Hélène as an example of what not to do. The wild girl who refused to follow the rules and would obviously never succeed. Even people who meant well told her that talent without discipline was worthless, that the music world had no place for people who could not conform to established standards of technique and performance. The young Haleen found herself caught in an impossible situation. She could feel the music inside her with absolute certainty, could hear in her mind the way pieces should sound, could access emotional depths in compositions that even her teachers seemed to miss. But the entire world of classical music education was telling her that her way was wrong, that her hands were wrong, that her intensity and passion and refusal to be gentle were fatal flaws that would destroy any chance she had of a real career. She was too young to articulate what she knew instinctively, too inexperienced to defend her approach with logic and evidence. All she had was the unshakable feeling that everyone else was trying to teach her a language that had nothing to do with the music she heard in her soul, and she simply could not force herself to speak it no matter how much easier that would make her life. The turning point came when Haleen was 13 years old, though at the time it felt less like salvation and more like one last desperate chance before everything fell apart completely. Her parents had nearly given up on finding a teacher who could work with their strange, intense daughter. The parade of piano instructors who had rejected her or been driven to frustration by her unorthodox approach had left everyone exhausted and discouraged. But then someone mentioned a teacher at the Conservatoire de Marseille, a woman named Jacqueline Courtin who had a reputation for being different herself, for seeing potential in students that others overlooked. It was not a glowing recommendation exactly, more like a last resort suggestion, the kind of thing people say when they have run out of conventional options. Jacqueline Courtin was not like the other teachers Haleen had encountered. She was older, with eyes that seemed to look past the surface of things and see what was actually happening underneath. When Haleen played for her at that first meeting, Courtin did not immediately start correcting her hand position or critiquing her technique. She listened with her whole body, leaning forward slightly, her face showing that she was hearing not just the notes but the intention behind them. After Haleen finished, there was a long silence that felt different from the disapproving silences she had learned to expect from teachers. This silence felt like thinking, like someone actually considering what they had just witnessed rather than comparing it to a checklist of proper technique. Courtin finally spoke, and what she said changed everything. She told Haleen that she was not broken or wrong or undisciplined. She said that Haleen had something rare and precious, a direct emotional connection to music that most people spent their entire lives trying to find and never quite reached. Yes, there were technical things to work on, skills to develop, knowledge to acquire. But the core of what Haleen was doing, that fierce honesty and refusal to perform music as a pretty surface decoration, that was exactly right. Courtin said she could work with this, that she wanted to work with this, that teaching a student like Haleen was why she had become a teacher in the first place. Haleen felt something crack open inside her chest, some tight knot of fear and shame that had been growing with each rejection and criticism. Under Courtin's guidance, Haleen began to develop technically without losing the wild emotional core that made her playing unique. It was not easy and it was not smooth. Courtin did not just accept everything Haleen did without question. She pushed hard, demanded excellence, refused to let passion be an excuse for sloppiness. But she pushed in a way that built up instead of tearing down, that added tools to Haleen's arsenal rather than trying to replace her instincts with someone else's rulebook. They worked on finger strength and precision, on understanding the architecture of compositions, on the historical context of different composers and periods. But always, Courtin insisted that technique existed to serve the music, not the other way around. The goal was never to make Haleen play like everyone else. The goal was to give her the skills to fully express what she already heard and felt. Progress came faster than anyone expected. Within a year of studying with Courtin, Haleen was playing at a level that stunned people who heard her. But the criticism did not stop just because she had found one teacher who believed in her. The broader classical music world still saw her as an oddity, a wild card, who broke too many rules to be taken seriously. When she performed in student recitals and local competitions, judges often gave her middling scores despite performances that left audiences breathless. They criticized her interpretation as too extreme, her dynamics as too violent, her entire approach as lacking the refinement expected in classical performance. She was too loud in the powerful moments and too soft in the delicate ones, pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable contrast. Her rubato, the slight speeding up and slowing down that adds expression to phrasing, was deemed excessive and self-indulgent. Other students and their parents whispered about her. Some were jealous of the attention she received even while being criticized, the way people could not stop talking about her performances even when they claimed to disapprove. Others genuinely believed she was ruining beautiful music with her aggressive, overly emotional approach. There were comments about her appearance too, the way she dressed and moved, the intensity in her eyes that made some people uncomfortable. Classical music had very specific ideas about how a young female pianist should present herself, and Haylene fit none of those expectations. She was not delicate or demure. She did not smile prettily and play with the kind of gentle competence that was considered appropriate for girls. She played like she was fighting for her life, like the music was something that had to be wrestled out of the piano through sheer force of will. At 15, Haylene auditioned for the Paris Conservatoire, the most prestigious music school in France and one of the top institutions in the world. Getting accepted there was the dream of every serious young musician in the country. Her audition was explosive, a performance that divided the faculty immediately. Some were horrified by what they saw as a complete lack of discipline and respect for classical tradition. Others were mesmerized by the raw talent and emotional power on display. The deliberations apparently went on for hours, with heated arguments about whether this strange girl from the South belonged at such an elite institution. In the end, she was accepted, but it was not the unanimous, enthusiastic acceptance given to obvious prodigies. It was a controversial decision, a gamble on potential, a grudging acknowledgement that something undeniable was happening when she played even if it made people uncomfortable. Paris was both liberation and trial by fire. On one hand, Haylene was finally surrounded by serious musicians, immersed in an environment where music was everything and excellence was the only standard that mattered. On the other hand, she was now at an institution with rigid traditions and powerful faculty members who had very specific ideas about the right way to play piano. Some of her teachers at the conservatoire loved her. They saw her as a breath of fresh air, a reminder of why music mattered in the first place. But others saw her as a threat to everything they had spent their careers building and defending. They criticized her relentlessly in master classes, held her up as an example of misguided passion overwhelming proper technique, questioned whether she truly belonged at the conservatoire at all. The pressure was immense. Haylene was still a teenager, still figuring out who she was and what she believed about music and life. She was living away from home for the first time, navigating the intense social dynamics of an elite institution where competition was fierce and everyone was talented. The self-doubt that had plagued her earlier years returned with new force. Maybe all those critics were right. Maybe she was just stubborn and deluded, unable to see that her approach was fundamentally flawed. She could conform if she tried hard enough, could sand down the rough edges and play in a way that earned approval instead of controversy. She knew how to do that now. She had the technical skills to perform in the accepted style if she chose to. But every time she tried to play it safe, to deliver the kind of performance that would earn high marks and approving nods, something inside her died a little and the music turned to ash in her hands. The breaking point came during her second year at the Paris Conservatoire when Haylene was 17 years old. She was assigned to perform Rachmaninoff's Piano Sonata No. 2 in a major recital, a piece that was notoriously difficult both technically and emotionally. It was the kind of composition that could make or break a young pianist's reputation, full of thundering passages that demanded incredible physical stamina and delicate moments that required the most sensitive touch. Her primary teacher at the time was a distinguished pianist who had very clear ideas about how Rachmaninoff should be interpreted. He wanted elegance and control, a performance that showcased the architectural beauty of the composition without drowning in excessive emotion. He coached Haylene repeatedly, correcting what he saw as her tendency to overdramatize, to push too hard in the climactic moments and linger too long in the reflective passages. Haylene tried to follow his guidance. She genuinely attempted to deliver the kind of performance he wanted, the kind that would prove she could conform to conservatoire standards when necessary. She practiced the piece his way, restraining her natural impulses, keeping everything within the boundaries of what was considered tasteful and appropriate. But as the recital date approached, she felt increasingly disconnected from the music. It was like she was playing someone else's interpretation, reading words in a foreign language without understanding their meaning. The night before the performance, she barely slept, her mind churning with anxiety and confusion. She kept hearing two versions of the piece in her head, the safe version her teacher wanted and the raw, honest version that wanted to pour out of her hands. When she walked onto the stage that evening, she still had not decided which version she would play. The audience was full of faculty members, fellow students, critics, and music professionals who had come to evaluate the conservatoire's rising talents. Haylene sat at the piano and placed her hands on the keys, feeling the familiar cool smoothness under her fingers. She took a breath and began to play. For the first few measures, she tried to maintain the controlled approach she had practiced. But then something inside her snapped, some dam that had been holding back the flood. Her hands moved with their own will, pulling from the piano exactly the sounds she heard in her soul. The delicate passages became almost unbearably tender, played so softly that people in the back rows had to lean forward to hear. The powerful sections exploded with a force that made some audience members physically recoil in their seats. She was not playing Rachmaninoff the way anyone expected. She was playing it the way it felt to her, with all the passion and pain and desperate beauty that she heard in the composition. Her body moved with the music, bending over the keys in the quiet moments and pulling back as if struck during the climaxes. Sweat formed on her forehead. Her breath came in gasps during the brief rests. She was completely lost in the performance, unaware of the audience, unaware of anything except the conversation happening between her hands and the piano. When the final notes faded into silence, she sat frozen for a moment, slowly coming back to awareness of where she was and what she had just done. She had completely ignored her teacher's instructions. She had played it her way and there would be consequences. The silence in the hall stretched out uncomfortably. Then someone in the back started clapping and suddenly the entire audience erupted. People were on their feet, some with tears streaming down their faces, applauding with an intensity that went far beyond polite appreciation. But Haleen could also see the faces of certain faculty members, including her teacher, whose expressions ranged from shock to anger to something that looked like betrayal. She had proven that she could move an audience, but she had also proven that she would not or could not be molded into the kind of pianist the conservatoire was designed to produce. In the days that followed, the controversy surrounding her performance became the talk of the entire school. Some called it the most exciting student performance they had ever witnessed. Others called it an undisciplined disaster that happened to emotionally manipulate an unsophisticated audience. Her teacher called her into his office for a conversation that was both painful and strangely liberating. He told her that she was enormously talented but fundamentally unteachable in the traditional sense. He said he could not continue to work with a student who refused to respect the guidance of someone with decades more experience. He was not cruel about it, but he was firm. Haleen could stay at the conservatoire, but she would need to find a different teacher, someone who could accept her unorthodox approach. The rejection stung, but it also clarified something important. She was never going to succeed by trying to become what others wanted her to be. She had to find her own path, even if that path was lonely and uncertain. She found a new mentor in Pierre Barbizet, a pianist and teacher who had a reputation for unconventional thinking. Barbizet saw immediately what Courtin had seen years earlier, that Haleen's approach was not a flaw to be corrected, but a gift to be cultivated. He worked with her on expanding her technical abilities and deepening her understanding of musical structure. But he never tried to tame the emotional intensity that made her performances unforgettable. Under his guidance, Haleen began to develop a more complete artistic identity, one that balanced her natural passion with increasing sophistication and control. She was learning to channel her intensity rather than simply unleashing it, to make artistic choices rather than just following emotional impulses. By the time she was 19, Haleen was starting to attract serious attention beyond the conservatoire. She won first prize at the Conservatoire de Paris, a validation that meant everything after years of being told she was doing it all wrong. But more importantly, she was beginning to get invitations to perform with professional orchestras and in respected concert halls. The classical music world was starting to realize that this young woman with the fierce hands and uncompromising approach might be something special, something they had not quite seen before. Critics who heard her in person often found themselves struggling to describe what made her performances so compelling. It was not just technical brilliance, though her technique had become formidable. It was something else, some quality of absolute presence and emotional honesty that made every performance feel like a high-stakes encounter rather than a polished presentation. But success did not erase the scars left by years of criticism and rejection. Haleen struggled with anxiety and self-doubt, with the fear that maybe she really was a fraud, that her emotional approach was just covering up fundamental inadequacies. She had nightmares about walking onto stage and discovering that her hands no longer worked, that the connection between her heart and the piano had somehow been severed. The pressure of emerging success was in some ways harder than the pressure of being dismissed. Now people had expectations. Now there was a reputation to maintain. Now every performance mattered in ways that student recitals never had. She began to develop rituals and patterns to manage her anxiety, ways of preparing mentally and physically that helped her access the state of mind she needed to perform at her highest level. At 21 years old, Haleen Grimaud signed her first recording contract with a major classical music label. This was the moment that separated serious professionals from talented students, the threshold that determined whether a classical musician would have an actual career or remain a skilled performer playing local recitals. The label executives were taking a risk on her and they knew it. She was controversial, unpredictable, and she did not fit the image that classical music typically presented to the world. But they also recognized that she had something magnetic, a quality that made people pay attention in an era when classical music was struggling to remain relevant to younger audiences. Her first album was carefully selected to showcase both her technical abilities and her distinctive interpretive voice. It included works by Rachmaninoff, Brahms, and Schumann, composers whose music contained the emotional depth that brought out the best in her playing. The recording process was grueling in ways that live performance never was. In concert, Hayley could surrender to the moment, could let the energy of the audience and the immediacy of the experience carry her forward. But in the recording studio, every note was captured permanently, every choice preserved forever to be analyzed and criticized. The engineers and producers wanted multiple takes of each section, wanted her to play passages over and over until they had options to choose from in editing. This methodical, dissected approach to music felt suffocating to someone whose entire artistic identity was built on spontaneity and emotional truth. She struggled to maintain the sense of discovery and immediacy that made her performances special when she was playing the same measures for the 20th time, while technicians discussed microphone placement and ambient noise. There were moments during those recording sessions when she wanted to walk out and never come back. She felt like the process was killing something essential in the music, turning it into a product to be manufactured and perfected rather than a living experience to be shared. But she pushed through, learning to find ways to stay connected to the emotional core of the pieces even in the artificial environment of the studio. She discovered that she could use the multiple takes to her advantage, to experiment with different approaches and push herself to find new depths in familiar music. When the album was finally released, the critical response was mixed in exactly the way she had learned to expect. Some reviewers praised her originality and emotional power, calling her one of the most exciting young pianists to emerge in years. Others criticized her for excessive dramatics and lack of classical restraint, suggesting that her approach was more about showmanship than serious musicianship. But something unexpected happened. Regular people, music lovers who were not professional critics or conservatoire professors, started buying her recordings in numbers that surprised everyone. They wrote letters to the label and to Hayley directly, describing how her performances had moved them, how they had heard these famous pieces dozens of times but never quite felt them the way she played them. Parents wrote about their teenagers, who normally had no interest in classical music, becoming obsessed with her recordings. People described listening to her Rachmaninoff while going through divorces, while grieving losses, while falling in love, and finding that the music spoke to their experiences in ways that more polished, controlled performances never had. This grassroots enthusiasm was both validating and terrifying. It meant that her approach was connecting with audiences, but it also created pressure to maintain that connection while continuing to grow as an artist. Hayley began touring internationally, performing in concert halls across Europe, Asia, and North America. This was the life she had always dreamed of, getting to play music every day for audiences who truly wanted to hear her. But the reality of being a touring classical musician was exhausting in ways she had not anticipated. There were endless flights and hotel rooms, constant jet lag, and the physical strain of performing at the highest level several times a week. There was the loneliness of being far from home and the strange displacement of never quite belonging anywhere. There were language barriers and cultural differences, technical problems with unfamiliar pianos, and the constant pressure to deliver extraordinary performances even when she was tired or sick or emotionally depleted. She also discovered that fame, even the relatively modest fame of a classical musician, came with its own set of problems. People had opinions about everything she did, from her musical interpretations to her clothes to her personal life. The media wanted to write stories about her, but they were more interested in creating a narrative than understanding the reality. Some articles portrayed her as a wild, untamed genius who played by instinct alone, completely ignoring the years of rigorous training and intellectual engagement with music that informed every performance. Others focused on her appearance and personal life in ways that male pianists never experienced, asking about her relationships and fashion choices instead of her musical philosophy. She learned to give interviews carefully, to protect her privacy while meeting the promotional obligations that came with recording contracts and concert bookings. During this period of rapid professional growth, Hayley began to feel increasingly disconnected from something essential in herself. The pace of touring and recording was relentless, and she found herself playing the same repertoire over and over, delivering variations on performances that had become too familiar. The spontaneity and sense of discovery that had always been central to her musicianship was harder to access when she was exhausted and overwhelmed. She started having panic attacks before performances, moments when she would stand in the wings feeling like she could not breathe, like she had forgotten how to play, like everything she had built was about to collapse. She hid these struggles from almost everyone, maintaining the professional facade that was expected while feeling increasingly fragile inside. The classical music world still had not quite figured out what to make of her. She was successful enough that she could not be dismissed, but controversial enough that she remained outside the inner circle of the most prestigious institutions and conductors. Some major orchestras and conductors refused to work with her, considering her interpretations too idiosyncratic and unreliable. Others sought her out specifically because of her distinctive voice, wanting the excitement and unpredictability she brought to familiar repertoire. She existed in a strange middle ground, neither fully accepted by the classical establishment nor completely rejected by it. This ambiguous status bothered her less than it might have earlier in her career. She was learning that trying to win approval from people who fundamentally misunderstood her artistic vision was a waste of energy. Then something happened that seemed completely unrelated to music, but would end up transforming her entire life and career. During a tour stop in northern Florida, Haylene visited a wolf sanctuary on a rare day off. She had always felt a deep connection to animals, but when she encountered the wolves, something profound shifted inside her. She saw in them a wildness that civilized society tried to suppress, a fierce authenticity that the world considered dangerous simply because it could not be fully controlled. She recognized herself in these creatures that were so often misunderstood and misrepresented. The experience awakened something in her, a realization that she had been slowly suffocating under the weight of expectations and professional obligations, that she needed to reclaim the wildness that had made her special in the first place. Haylene returned to Europe from that American tour with a new clarity about what was missing in her life. She could not stop thinking about the wolves, about their dignity and power, about the way they existed fully in their own nature without apology or compromise. She began researching wolf conservation and quickly became horrified by what she learned. Wolves were misunderstood and persecuted, hunted nearly to extinction in many places, victims of myths and fears that had nothing to do with the reality of these magnificent animals. She saw a direct parallel to her own experience in the music world, where anything that did not fit neatly into established categories was treated as a problem to be solved or a threat to be eliminated. She decided she needed to do more than just be moved by wolves. She needed to actually help them. In 1996, when she was 27 years old, Haylene did something that shocked everyone in the classical music world. She founded a wolf conservation center in upstate New York, dedicating significant amounts of her time, money, and energy to the project. This was not a celebrity dabbling in a trendy cause. She immersed herself completely in understanding wolf behavior, ecology, and conservation needs. She worked with biologists and wildlife experts, learning about pack dynamics and habitat requirements. She used her growing fame to raise awareness about wolf conservation, talking about it in interviews that were supposed to be about her music career, donating proceeds from concerts to conservation efforts. Many people in the classical music establishment thought she had lost her mind, that she was throwing away her career for a foolish distraction. But the opposite happened. Getting deeply involved in something outside of music liberated Haylene as an artist in ways she had not expected. She stopped caring so much about what critics said or whether she was playing pieces exactly the way tradition demanded. She had found a purpose larger than her own career, a cause that put her musical struggles into perspective. The wolves did not care whether she played Brahms with appropriate restraint or too much passion. They simply were what they were, and they reminded her every day to do the same. Her performances became even more powerful and distinctive during this period. She was less anxious, less caught up in trying to prove anything, more present and authentic in the moment of making music. Audiences could feel the difference, even if they could not articulate what had changed. Her personal life had always been kept intensely private, but during this period, Haylene began to open up slightly about her struggles with anxiety, depression, and the pressures of being a professional musician who never quite fit the mold. She talked in a few interviews about having been diagnosed with synesthesia, a neurological condition where senses blend together in unusual ways. For her, music created colors and physical sensations, a vivid sensory experience that went far beyond just hearing notes. This helped explain why her performances were so intensely physical and emotional. She was not just playing sounds. She was translating a complex multisensory experience into movements at the keyboard. This revelation made some critics reconsider their harsh judgments. Maybe she had not been undisciplined or overly dramatic. Maybe she had been accurately representing her genuine experience of the music, which was simply more intense and layered than what most people felt. She also began to speak more openly about her difficulties with traditional learning and the education system. She had struggled in regular school as well as in music conservatories, her mind working in ways that did not fit conventional teaching methods. She talked about how close she had come to giving up on music entirely during her teenage years, how the constant criticism had made her doubt the one thing she knew with absolute certainty. She shared these stories not for sympathy but to encourage other young people who felt like they did not fit, who had talents and passions that did not match what society expected from them. The response was overwhelming. She received thousands of letters from people who had felt like outcasts in their own fields, who had been told they were doing it wrong, who had almost given up on their dreams because they could not conform. Around this time, Haylene also began to take more control over her repertoire choices and recording projects. She had earned enough success and credibility that she could push back against label executives who wanted her to record the safest, most commercially proven pieces. She started exploring music that was less frequently performed, composers who were underrepresented in the standard concert repertoire. She championed contemporary composers, giving premieres of new works and proving that classical music did not have to be a museum dedicated only to dead composers. She also returned to familiar pieces but approached them in new ways, recording second or third versions that showed how her understanding had deepened and evolved. Her recordings during this period were artistic triumphs that divided critics as sharply as ever. Her album of Beethoven sonatas was called both a revelation and a travesty, often in the same publication by different reviewers. Some heard her interpretations as bringing fresh life to pieces that had become overly familiar, stripping away decades of performance tradition to get back to something raw and immediate. Others accused her of distorting Beethoven to serve her own ego, of imposing her personality on music that deserved more humble service. Haylene had learned to live with this divided response. She understood by now that the people who loved her playing loved it passionately, while the people who disliked it often did so with equal intensity. There was rarely a middle ground, and she had made peace with that. She began collaborating with artists from other genres, working with jazz musicians, electronic composers, and even rock performers. This was controversial in the classical world, which tended to view such crossover projects as diluting the purity of classical music. But Haylene saw these collaborations as natural extensions of her artistic curiosity. Music was music, and the arbitrary boundaries between genres seemed increasingly meaningless to her. These projects also introduced her playing to audiences who would never attend a traditional classical concert. People who discovered through her that classical music did not have to be stuffy or inaccessible. Some of these collaborative albums were more successful than others, but they all represented Haylene's refusal to be confined to a single lane or definition of what a classical pianist should be. The new millennium brought changes to the entire classical music industry. Recording sales were declining as digital piracy became widespread, and concert halls were struggling to attract younger audiences. Many classical musicians saw this as a crisis, a sign that their art form was dying. But Haylene saw it as an opportunity to reinvent how classical music connected with people. She embraced new technologies, releasing albums digitally and engaging with fans through early social media platforms. She performed in unconventional venues, bringing classical music to clubs and outdoor festivals where it had rarely been heard. She participated in educational outreach programs, playing in schools and community centers, trying to spark in young people the same passion that had saved her life when she was a child. Through all of this, her commitment to wolf conservation remained central. She split her time between touring as a pianist and working at the conservation center, living a double life that exhausted her but also kept her grounded. The wolves needed her in a way that was completely different from how audiences needed her. They required her practical presence, her physical work, her daily attention. They did not care about her reputation or her artistic legacy. This balance between the intensely public world of concert performance and the intimate physical world of animal care gave her a completeness that music alone had never provided. She began to see her two passions as connected rather than separate, both expressions of a fundamental commitment to authenticity and wildness in a world that constantly tried to tame and domesticate everything powerful. By her mid-30s, Haylene Grimaud had achieved a rare status in the classical music world. She was internationally recognized, able to sell out major concert halls and command significant fees for performances. Her recordings consistently appeared on classical music charts, and she had built a devoted following that spanned generations and crossed traditional boundaries between classical music fans and general audiences. But she had achieved this success entirely on her own terms, without compromising the fierce individuality that had made her journey so difficult in the early years. She was proof that the critics who had told her she would never succeed unless she conformed had been wrong, though it had taken decades of struggle to reach this point. The classical music establishment gradually, grudgingly, began to acknowledge what audiences had known for years. She was not just a talented pianist with an unusual approach. She was one of the most important and distinctive artists of her generation, someone whose performances would be remembered and studied long after more technically perfect but less distinctive pianists had been forgotten. Major orchestras that had once avoided her now competed to book her. Prestigious festivals invited her as a headliner. The most respected conductors, including some who had initially dismissed her, sought opportunities to collaborate. This validation from the very institutions that had once rejected her was satisfying in some ways. But Haylene had learned not to need their approval the way she once had. She continued to take artistic risks that other pianists at her level would have avoided. In 2006, she performed and recorded Beethoven's Piano Concerto No. 4 with the Vienna Philharmonic, one of the most conservative and tradition-bound orchestras in the world. Her interpretation was predictably controversial, with some musicians in the orchestra visibly struggling with her tempo choices and dynamic extremes during rehearsals. But when the live performance happened, something magical occurred. The tension between her unorthodox approach and the orchestra's traditional style created an electricity that made the familiar piece sound newly written. The audience response was overwhelming, and even critics who had reservations about her choices had to admit that the performance was unforgettable. Her recordings became more ambitious and conceptual during this period. Rather than just releasing albums of works by a single composer or from a single period, she began creating thematic programs that told larger stories. She paired pieces in unexpected ways, finding connections between composers from different eras who had never been programmed together. She wrote extensive liner notes explaining her thinking, inviting listeners to hear the music through her perspective. These were not just collections of pieces she played well. They were artistic statements, carefully constructed arguments about the meaning and emotional content of the works. Some classical music purists found this approach pretentious, but many listeners appreciated being given a framework for understanding her interpretive choices. She also began conducting masterclasses and teaching selected students, though she was careful about how she approached this role. She remembered too well how destructive bad teaching had been in her own development, how close she had come to losing music entirely because of teachers who could not see past their own rigid ideas. She refused to teach at traditional conservatories with their structured curricula and institutional pressures. Instead, she worked privately with young pianists who reminded her of her younger self, students who had enormous talent but did not fit conventional molds. She taught them not to play like her, but to find their own authentic voices, to trust their instincts while developing the technical skills to express those instincts fully. Several of her students went on to significant careers, and they often talked about how she had saved them from giving up, just as Jacqueline Courtin had saved her. Her personal life remained intensely private despite her public career. She had relationships, some serious and long-lasting, but she protected those details fiercely from media intrusion. She talked occasionally about the difficulty of maintaining intimate connections when her life involved constant travel and such intense engagement with music. She admitted that she had sometimes chosen her career over relationships, made decisions that prioritized her artistic development over personal stability. She expressed no regrets about these choices, but there was a wistfulness in how she discussed the road not taken, the more conventional life she might have had if she had been a different kind of person. She spoke about loneliness, about the isolating nature of being so different, about the price of refusing to compromise your essential nature. The Wolf Conservation Center she had founded continued to grow and expand its impact. It became a respected institution in wildlife conservation circles, doing important work in education and advocacy as well as caring for wolves. Haylene remained deeply involved, serving on the board and participating in major decisions about the center's direction. She used her concert appearances to raise funds and awareness, often mentioning the wolves in interviews and finding ways to connect her musical and conservation work. Some people in the classical music world never understood this dual commitment, seeing it as a distraction from music. But for Haylene, the two passions were inseparable, different expressions of the same core values of wildness, authenticity, and refusing to be tamed by society's expectations. As she entered her 40s, Haleen began to reflect more publicly on her journey and what it had taught her. She gave speeches and wrote articles about the importance of supporting children and young people whose minds work differently, who do not fit standard educational models. She talked about neurodiversity before it became a widely used term, arguing that many people labeled as difficult or disabled were actually experiencing the world in valuable ways that conventional systems could not accommodate. She became an advocate for changing how music is taught, for creating more flexible and individualized approaches that could nurture different kinds of talents. She acknowledged that not every student needed or would benefit from the kind of intense, unorthodox approach that had worked for her. But she argued passionately that there needed to be room in music education for students who did not thrive in traditional settings. She also spoke about the importance of finding purpose beyond your primary career, of having commitments and passions that existed outside the professional identity that consumed so much energy. She credited her work with Wolves for keeping her sane and grounded during difficult periods in her musical career. When music became too stressful or too consuming, when the pressure and criticism became overwhelming, she could go to the conservation center and remember that there were other ways to make a contribution, other sources of meaning beyond concert reviews and recording contracts. She encouraged other artists to find their own versions of this, whatever it might be, something that mattered deeply but existed outside the competitive pressure of their professional lives. During this period, she returned to some of the repertoire that had caused such controversy early in her career, recording new versions that showed how her interpretations had evolved. Her second recording of the Rachmaninoff Sonata that had caused such turmoil at the Conservatoire was notably different from her first recording and even more different from that explosive student performance. It was still unmistakably her, still full of passion and intensity, but it also showed a new level of maturity and control. She could be wild when wildness served the music, but she could also be restrained when restraint was more powerful. The difference was that these were now conscious artistic choices rather than just emotional impulses. She had learned to harness her intensity rather than simply unleashing it. The 2010 decade brought new challenges and opportunities for Haleen as the classical music world continued to evolve rapidly. Streaming services changed how people discovered and consumed music. Social media created new ways for artists to connect directly with audiences, and the traditional structures that had governed classical music careers for centuries were breaking down. Some older musicians struggled with these changes, mourning the loss of familiar systems and gatekeepers. But Haleen embraced the new landscape. She had never fit comfortably into the old systems anyway, so their disruption felt more like liberation than loss. She built a strong social media presence, sharing not just professional updates but glimpses into her life with the Wolves, her practice routines, her thoughts about music and conservation. She began experimenting with new ways of presenting classical music that took advantage of digital technologies. She created video content that combined her performances with nature footage from the conservation center, visually representing the connections she felt between music and wild animals. She participated in live-streamed concerts and interactive online events where audiences could ask questions and engage directly with her. She used crowdfunding platforms to finance recording projects that might not have found support from traditional record labels, allowing her fans to directly support work they wanted to hear. These experiments did not always succeed, but they showed a willingness to keep evolving and trying new approaches rather than simply repeating what had worked in the past. She also became more vocal about issues within the classical music industry that she believed needed to change. She talked about the gender disparities that still plagued orchestras and conducting, the lack of diversity in programming and hiring, the economic structures that made it nearly impossible for young musicians to build sustainable careers. She used her platform to advocate for systemic changes, sometimes making people in positions of power uncomfortable with her directness. She had reached a point in her career where she had very little to lose by speaking honestly. She was established enough that most orchestras and presenters could not afford to completely blacklist her, but she was still enough of an outsider that the establishment had limited leverage over her. She used this freedom to say things that younger or more institutionally dependent musicians could not say publicly. Her performances during this period took on a new depth that many critics and longtime fans noticed. She was playing at the peak of her technical abilities, with decades of experience allowing her to execute even the most demanding passages with apparent ease. But more importantly, there was a wisdom and emotional complexity in her interpretations that came only from living a full life, from experiencing loss and joy and struggle and triumph. She could access not just passion but the whole range of human emotions, bringing to the music a psychological insight that was breathtaking. When she played pieces about grief or loneliness, audiences heard someone who understood those feelings intimately. When she played music of joy and celebration, it carried the weight of someone who knew how precious and fleeting such moments were. She collaborated during this time with some of the most interesting artists of the younger generation, both in classical music and beyond. She worked with young composers who were creating new pieces specifically for her, writing music that took advantage of her particular strengths and distinctive voice. She performed in multimedia productions that combined music with video art, dance, and theatrical elements. She appeared on albums with indie rock bands and electronic producers, bringing her classical training to genres where it was unexpected. These collaborations were not always critically acclaimed, and some of them were frankly unsuccessful experiments. But they showed an artist who was still curious and adventurous, still willing to risk failure in pursuit of new experiences and creative growth. The Conservation Center faced challenges during this period as well. Funding was always difficult. Political attitudes toward wolf protection fluctuated with changing administrations, and the physical work of caring for wolves and maintaining facilities never stopped demanding time and resources. Haylene poured enormous amounts of her concert earnings into keeping the center running, sometimes at significant personal financial cost. There were moments when she considered whether the burden was sustainable, whether she could continue splitting her life between two such demanding commitments. But she always came back to the conviction that the wolves needed advocates, and she was in a unique position to be one. Her fame as a musician gave her a platform to talk about conservation in ways that traditional wildlife advocates could not access. She also dealt during this decade with the inevitable physical challenges that come with aging as a performing pianist. The human body was not designed to execute the kinds of movements that piano performance demands for hours every day across decades. She developed issues with her hands and wrists, had to work with physical therapists and specialists to manage pain and maintain function. She adjusted her practice routines and performance schedule, being more careful about how she used her hands, building in more rest and recovery time. These adjustments were humbling for someone who had always relied on physical intensity and stamina. But they also taught her new things about efficiency and precision, about working smarter rather than just harder. Some of her most refined and subtle performances came during this period when she could not rely on sheer physical power the way she had when she was younger. She continued to struggle periodically with anxiety and depression, the mental health challenges that had shadowed her throughout her life. She was more open about these struggles now, talking in interviews about therapy and the importance of mental health care. She described music as both a healing force and sometimes a source of tremendous pressure, a double-edged relationship that required constant attention and balance. She talked about the loneliness of touring, the difficulty of maintaining stable relationships, the strange displacement of spending so much time in transit between places. She was honest about the fact that the life of a performing artist, while privileged and rewarding in many ways, also came with real costs to personal well-being. This honesty was unusual in the classical music world, where there was often pressure to maintain an image of effortless grace and to hide any struggles behind a polished public persona. During this time, major career retrospectives began to appear. Publications compiled lists of essential Haylene Grimaud recordings. Critics wrote long essays reassessing her entire career, tracing the evolution of her artistry across decades. Some of the same critics who had dismissed her early in her career now praised her as a visionary who had understood something important that the establishment had missed. These reassessments were vindicating in some ways, but they also felt strange to Haylene. She had not changed her fundamental approach. She was still doing essentially what she had always done, playing music the way it felt true to her. The fact that critical opinion had shifted said more about changes in the culture and the industry than about changes in her artistry. She had simply outlasted the skeptics, survived long enough for the world to catch up to what she had always known about herself. She began working on a memoir during this period, though it took years to complete because she was such a perfectionist about the writing. She wanted to tell her story in her own words, to correct the many misunderstandings and mythologies that had grown up around her career. She wanted to be honest about the struggles and the moments when she had almost given up, but she also wanted to avoid creating a simple triumph over adversity narrative that would flatten the complexity of her experience. She worked with a skilled editor who helped her shape the material, but every word was ultimately hers. When the book was finally published, it revealed layers of her thinking and experience that audiences had never seen, making her even more interesting and human to the many people who had only known her through her music. Now in her 50s, Haylene Grimaud occupies a unique position in the classical music world. She is an elder stateswoman of sorts, though she resists that framing because it sounds too settled and conventional. She continues to perform regularly, still bringing the same intensity and commitment to every concert that she brought as a young woman, though now tempered with the wisdom of decades of experience. Her name on a concert program still generates excitement and draws audiences who know they will experience something distinctive, a performance that takes risks and refuses to play it safe. She has become the kind of artist that music lovers make special trips to hear, knowing that her interpretations will be memorable and possibly controversial, but never boring or routine. Her recordings have become a significant part of the classical music catalog, essential listening for anyone interested in piano performance from the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Some of her interpretations have become definitive for many listeners, the version they hear in their minds when they think of certain pieces. Music students and young performers study her recordings, sometimes to emulate her approach and sometimes to define themselves against it. She has influenced a generation of pianists, many of whom have never studied with her directly, but have absorbed from her recordings the lesson that it is possible to be successful while remaining true to an unorthodox vision. The classical music world is more open now to diverse approaches and individual voices than it was when she was starting out. And she deserves some credit for helping to create that openness by proving that audiences responded to authenticity even when critics initially did not. The Wolf Conservation Center remains central to her life and identity. It has now been operating for more than 25 years, has educated hundreds of thousands of people about wolves, and has contributed to successful wolf reintroduction programs in several regions. Haylene continues to split her time between music and conservation work, though the balance has shifted somewhat as she has gotten older. She performs fewer concerts per year now, being more selective about engagements and building in more time at home with the wolves. She has assembled a strong team to run the day-to-day operations of the center, allowing her to focus on the aspects of the work she finds most meaningful. The wolves she has known across decades have become like family to her, their pack dynamics and individual personalities as familiar as human relationships. When wolves she has known for years die, she grieves them deeply, taking time to process the loss before returning to her demanding schedule. She has become a mentor to numerous young artists who reach out to her seeking guidance. She is selective about these relationships, knowing she does not have the time or energy to help everyone who asks. But when she recognizes something of herself in a young musician, that particular combination of enormous talent and difficulty fitting into conventional structures, she makes time. She has helped several young performers navigate the difficult early career years, giving them not just musical advice but practical guidance about the industry, emotional support during periods of doubt, and the crucial message that it is possible to succeed without compromising your essential nature. Some of these mentoring relationships have developed into genuine friendships that continue long after the initial guidance was needed. Looking back on her journey, Haylene sees the early criticism and rejection not as obstacles that she heroically overcame, but as necessary parts of forming her artistic identity. If the conservatoire had simply embraced her from the beginning, if teachers had not pushed back against her unorthodox approach, she might have been absorbed into conventional ways of playing and thinking about music. The resistance she encountered forced her to become crystal clear about what she believed, to develop the inner strength to trust herself when everyone else was saying she was wrong. The teachers who rejected her were not villains in her story. They were simply people defending what they knew and valued, unable to recognize something that fell outside their framework. She bears no grudges now, understanding that the classical music world of her youth was operating from genuinely held beliefs about what constituted excellence, beliefs that she simply could not accept for herself. She thinks often about the young girl she was, the confused and desperate teenager who felt broken because she could not learn music the way teachers said she should. She wishes she could go back and tell that girl that everything was going to be all right, that the qualities that seemed like fatal flaws would eventually become her greatest strengths, that the criticism and rejection would not last forever. She knows that somewhere right now there are young people going through similar struggles, being told they are doing it wrong, wondering if they should give up on their dreams because they cannot conform to expectations. This is why she continues to speak publicly about her journey, why she shares the difficult parts and not just the triumphs. If even one young person hears her story and decides to keep going, to trust their own instincts despite the criticism, then all the exposure and vulnerability of sharing her struggles will have been worthwhile. Her relationship with the piano has continued to evolve even after all these years. She has played millions of notes across thousands of performances, has probably spent more hours at the keyboard than doing any other single activity in her life. But the instrument can still surprise her, can still reveal new possibilities and sonorities that she has never quite heard before. She practices differently now than she did when she was younger, working more on sound quality and color than on speed or power, exploring the subtlest gradations of dynamics and timing. She is interested in how much meaning can be communicated through the smallest variations, how a tiny change in touch or pedaling can completely transform the emotional content of a passage. This is the work of maturity, of an artist who has mastered the obvious effects and is now pursuing the nearly invisible nuances that separate great performances from transcendent ones. She has made peace with the fact that she will always divide opinion, that there will always be listeners who find her approach too much, too intense, too emotional. She used to worry about negative reviews and criticism, would sometimes lie awake at night replaying harsh comments in her mind. But she has reached a point where she genuinely does not need universal approval. She knows that her playing deeply moves many people, that she has created meaningful experiences for countless listeners, that her recordings will outlive her and continue to speak to future generations. The critics who have never understood her work are welcome to their opinions. They are not wrong exactly, just responding to something that is not meant for them. There is plenty of beautiful, polished, restrained piano playing available for people who want that. She offers something different, and the people who need what she offers know exactly where to find it. The question of legacy is complicated for Haylene. She has never been driven primarily by ambition or the desire for historical recognition. She plays music because she has to, because it is how she processes her experience of being alive, because the conversation between her inner world and the piano is essential to her existence. If that process happens to create performances and recordings that other people value, that is a wonderful bonus but not the primary purpose. Still, she is human enough to hope that her work will be remembered, that future pianists and music lovers will find something valuable in her interpretations and her willingness to chart her own path. She hopes she has expanded in some small way the range of what is considered acceptable in classical music performance, made it slightly easier for the next generation of mavericks and outsiders to find their place. She continues to plan for the future with the same intensity and curiosity that has always defined her. There are composers she wants to explore more deeply, recording projects she wants to complete, new collaborations she wants to attempt. She is learning pieces now that will take years to fully mature, planting seeds that will flower later. She remains committed to the Conservation Center and is working on succession planning to ensure the organization will continue thriving after she is no longer able to be actively involved. She thinks about writing another book, perhaps something that focuses more on the philosophy of music and performance rather than autobiography. She wants to do more teaching, to pass on what she has learned to artists who can carry it forward in their own ways. When Haylene Grimaud sits down at a piano now, in her 50s, with decades of experience and struggle and triumph behind her, she is still that fierce young girl who heard music as color and sensation, who felt everything too intensely, whose hands attacked the keyboard with a force that terrified her teachers. But she is also something more, something richer and deeper, an artist who has spent a lifetime learning how to channel that intensity into meaningful expression. The criticism and ridicule she endured early in her career, the countless times she was told her hands and her approach were wrong, did not break her. They forged her into someone stronger and clearer, someone who knows exactly who she is and refuses to apologize for it. Every note she plays carries the weight of that journey, the proof that the people who tried to tame her were wrong, that wildness and discipline can coexist, that the most powerful music comes from artists who dare to be completely themselves. She turned the laughter into silence not through compromise or conformity, but by having the courage to trust that her truth was worth fighting for, and the stubbornness to keep fighting until the world finally listened.